This is Susan Silver, and this is the second part of researching education law. So in this segment, we're going to talk about creating a research plan. And there are several components of the research plan. One would be defining the issue. The second would be determining the jurisdiction. The third would be to select sources and then execute your search. And I'm going to talk in a little more detail about each one. So the first step would be to define the question or issue. You need to think about what your legal issue is and kind of divide that from the facts of the given situation. You want to do things like brainstorm keywords, synonyms, think of related terms, words with legal words as well as words within the discipline. You also want to look at what information you already have. Perhaps you read something that talked to a particular case. Perhaps you already have policy statements and statutes. You want to gather all that information together. The next step would be to determine the jurisdiction. Generally speaking, there are two jurisdictions. One would be at the federal level, the other would be at the state level. And you want to make sure that you're searching for legal authority, that is legislation, case law, etc., that's within the proper jurisdiction. The federal government and the state governments, although they work in tandem, they have responsibilities for different things. So always look to the legislation. So for example, in the field of education, although some issues are adjudicated by the state and legislated by the state, there are overriding issues that are adjudicated by the federal government. So for example, if it's a constitutional issue, like a freedom of speech issue, that would always be supersede any state law. And the other thing is that some issues have both federal and state implications. It's important to understand the hierarchy of the U.S. court system so you kind of know where to look, particularly when you're searching for case law. Each state, as well as the federal government, has a hierarchy. The lowest court being in the state level would be the state trial courts, or sometimes they're called municipal courts. At the federal level, those would be the U.S. district courts. And that's typically where you see a lot of case law starting, lawsuits filed in a lower court and then works its way up through the Court of Appeals. In the state of Florida, we have an intermediate appellate court, and then it goes to the state Supreme Court, and then of course everything ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court if they choose to hear it. At the federal level, you start in the district court and then things progress up through the Court of Appeals, although many times things are filed in higher courts like the U.S. Court of Appeals. And then again, if the Supreme Court wants to hear it, it may end up being up at the Supreme Court level. Federal courts tend to hear things, cases regarding the Constitution, regarding legislation that's passed by the federal government. And then the other thing that they sometimes intervene in is when state or local legislation is in conflict with federal law. So for example, if a state passes a law that's in direct conflict with a federal law, you see this lately with things like immigration. You see this with abortion laws, local abortion laws that are in conflict with federal law, things like that. And so the federal courts will intervene and hear those cases and make decisions. Here is a map of the different courts of appeal, how they divide up the country. And again, you've probably seen a lot in the news lately about the different circuits. And, you hear things about, well, they filed a case in the Ninth Circuit because the Ninth Circuit tends to be very liberal. Look at the states are involved. You've got Washington, California, Hawaii, etc. The Florida falls into the 11th Circuit, which is somewhat conservative, as well as the 5th Circuit. So again, you typically file within the circuit where whatever issue is being affected is within that area geographically. Each state has its own court system, and again, many times things will go to the federal level, but each state is empowered to create their own judiciary. Typically, there is a local level or municipal court system, and then some states have an appellate system, and then all states have a Supreme Court where decisions about state legislation take place. Just a couple of FYIs when you're searching for case law. Many times students, when they're doing research, want to look at local issues, perhaps issues involving the Hillsborough County school system, the Pinellas County school system, and they want to see cases that were filed in those lower courts, typically lawsuits, things like that. It is very unusual for those lower courts to publish decisions either online or in print. Usually, if you want a copy of a case, you have to go to the courthouse or contact the courthouse, and they do charge you. Now, there are some online systems that attorneys use where you can track cases online, but we don't have access to any of those kinds of things, and it's extremely expensive to do that. So you want to usually look for higher court decisions anyway to supplement your argument. And then the other thing is that cases that do not go to court at all, that is perhaps someone chose to sue the school system for some reason and the school system settled with them, or agreed to take a particular action, and then things were pulled out of the court system, you're not going to find any information about it within the court transcripts at all. So the next step would be to select the sources of legal information where you're going to search. The USF Library has subscriptions to a couple of law databases. One would be Westlaw, the other is called Nexus Uni. I prefer Westlaw. It's actually the same system that attorneys use. You will have access to both federal and state information, cases, statutes, etc. And then we also have access to databases that are specific to education. You're probably familiar with these, things like Education Source and ERIC, and you can do searching within those kinds of sources, looking for what researchers are writing about in the field of education law. There are also a lot of websites, since legal information, government information is all free on the web. There are a lot of good websites where you can do legal research. A couple are Google Scholar has a collection of legal materials, as do things like FindLaw and the Legal Information Institute at Cornell University. So if you have a citation, and a lot of people end up starting with a citation because they've read something, maybe within a journal article or their textbook, and you just want to get a copy of that case, you want to use those legal databases. You want to use Westlaw, Nexus Uni, or you can go into Google Scholar and pull the actual case. However, if you start with a topic, I highly recommend that you use secondary sources, that is, books and articles on the topic, because within those books and articles, they are going to cite you relevant legal authority. That is case law, that is statutory law, and you want to rely on those secondary sources because they're written for researchers, by scholars in that area, and they will name those specific cases and statutes that are going to be of interest to that particular topic. So focus on using those secondary sources. And again, you can use some of the education databases and craft a search. I'm going to have a video about that too, that's going to talk to how to do those searches. You can also use something like Google Scholar. There's a lot of legal publications indexed by Google Scholar, as well as Westlaw and Nexus Uni have a whole category of what we call law reviews, which are legal journals that you can search. And then the last thing you want to do is actually execute that search. Again, use those secondary sources. As you are reading through journal articles, or maybe you've progressed to finding case law, look at the cases that they are citing. I mean, if you're looking at a journal article, they're probably going to point you to things like Supreme Court cases. If you're reading a case about a particular topic, look at the cases that the justices are citing as authority. Those are going to be the ones that you're going to want to look at. And if you see the same case being cited over and over in different cases, that's probably a good precedent-setting case that you're going to be wanting to take a look at. So just a couple of final tips. Learn the legal words for your issue, at least define what your legal issue is. Think about some good key terms. And then again, I highly recommend that you use those secondary sources as a foot in the door.